On behalf of the Arnold A. Saltzman Institute Award in Peace Studies, I welcome you to our retrospective decade after September 11th, and a set of perspectives on the subject that defines the occasion, terrorism. Now, in an event like this, one might suspect some risk of dwelling on issues and ideas that have been discussed to death over the course of the past 10 years. We don't intend to do that this morning. Rather, we hope to shed light on some novel topics as well as those whose salience is well recognized. And among organizations at Columbia, the Saltzman Institute, I think, is ideally chartered and positioned to reflect on this subject. The Institute houses researchers who investigate all sorts of political violence and means of preventing or coping with it. As will become clear this morning, our people have done quite varied work on terrorism and issues related to it. You'll hear about some of the things that have preoccupied policymakers and commentators in this country, but you'll also hear some things that are less familiar about selected aspects of terrorism around the world that get less constant attention here, but that are quite important. The ratio of new perspectives to familiar ones in what's discussed today should prove to be high. I won't waste much more time droning on about the solemnity of the occasion or the importance of the subject. I'll suggest, though, that there are two mistakes often made about that question of the importance of terrorism: to overestimate it and to underestimate it. Before September 11th, it was underestimated. In the year before the attacks, I served as a member of the National Commission on Terrorism established by Congress. And our report made a number of recommendations for reducing the odds of an attack. But the recommendations, like those of most national commissions, were not implemented because of the inconvenience they'd cause, political inertia, and especially because of the insufficient salience of the threat as it was perceived at the time. After September 11th, the importance of terrorism came to be overestimated if one thinks in terms of cold statistics of actual damage done by terrorists over time compared to other forms of political violence. The psychological impact of terrorism has usually exceeded its material impact, although the casualty toll on September 11th, the highest in an active war for the United States, I think, since the Battle of Antietam, blurred that distinction. The limitations of terrorist action since September 11th and the passage of time have dulled that psychological impact a bit. So we may be sliding back toward underestimation. In any case, terrorism remains a significant problem in different forms in many places throughout the world in ways that Americans don't always appreciate. So today you'll hear about some of those issues, and then you'll have a chance to discuss your questions with the panelists. And to get us underway, I turn the reins over to the panel chair, Professor Tanya Putnam, who's an expert on matters generally not well respected by terrorists, international law.
All right, thank you very much. So you all should have a program on your chair, so you can see kind of how the order of things is going to go. We have 5 presentations today. We'll do the first 3, and then we'll have a short 10-minute break in between. So each person is going to talk. I'll introduce them as they go. We'd like you to save up all your questions towards the end, and after we've gone through all 5 presentations, we'll have an hour, hour and a half to actually have a discussion about what we hear today. So with that, we'll start with Dr. Stuart Gottlieb. He is an adjunct professor of international and public affairs at SIPA here, and also an affiliate of the Saltzman Institute at Columbia. Dr. Gottlieb holds a teaching position at New York University also, so he gets around. He's involved in everything. Prior to joining SIPA in 2003, he worked for nearly 5 years in the U.S. Senate, first as a senior foreign policy advisor to Senator Charles Schumer of New York, and also subsequently as a policy advisor and chief speechwriter for Senator Christopher Dodd of Connecticut. Dr. Gottlieb has also worked on several political campaigns, including the New York City re-election campaign for Mayor Giuliani, and also was his advisor on terrorism-related matters in his bid for the presidency in 2008. His publications include an edited volume, prominently an edited volume called Debating Terrorism and Counterterrorism, Causes, Contexts, and Responses, which was published in 2010 by CQ Press. So
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for coming today. Braving the latest terrorist warnings. So we're at the 10th anniversary of 9/11, and this anniversary offers a moment not only for assessment of all that has occurred, as Dick aptly introduced, all that has occurred over the past decade, but also offers an opportunity for reflection. So I'd like to begin with a brief personal experience from the day of the 9/11 attacks, which I believe offers insights into the topic of my talk today, which is on terror threats and policy responses since 9/11. On 9/11, 2001, as Tanya pointed out, I was working in Washington as a foreign affairs and national security advisor for a New York senator. I'd been there for about 3 years at that point, and I think everyone in this room recognizes that, like the assassination of John F. Kennedy a generation earlier, everyone of the present generation remembers where they were when the Twin Towers were hit and when they fell. I was driving to work at around 8:30 in the morning, listening to National Public Radio as usual, and I heard that a small plane had struck the North Tower of the World Trade Center in what was being called an accident at that point. Sounded odd to me. I thought little of it until, as I was pulling into the garage of the Hart Building on Capitol Hill around 9 o'clock, I heard that a second plane struck the second tower, and these were not small planes, these were now commercial airliners. When I heard that, I knew this was a major terrorist attack, most likely originating from overseas. I recall pulling into my parking space, turning off the radio, and I literally sat there for about 10 minutes, pondering not only what was waiting for me, sorry, it's an emotional day, what was waiting for me when I walked into the office that day, which was obviously a lot, but also how much my life and the lives of all Americans and millions more around the world were going to change in countless and unforeseen ways in the months and years to come. I don't have enough time to go into all the swirl of events that are making me so emotional. I lost a lot of friends that day in New York, and a lot of stuff was going on down in D.C. Many other people in the room have experienced a lot of things, but let me just give a few of my quick experiences that I think could highlight the direction I want to go with my talk. We learned early on that it was Al-Qaeda from passenger manifests and intelligence cross lists. I was actually one of the first people to know that. I bumped into a friend of mine who worked for Tom Daschle, who was the majority leader in the Senate at the time, and he told me, and I guess it's safe to say now, that I was one of the sources that tipped off CNN, who broke the story that it was Al-Qaeda. We were briefed the next morning that there was a near certainty of major follow-on attacks in the coming weeks and months, possibly with the use of weapons of mass destruction. And that turned out to be accurate. We know after Jose Padilla, an American citizen, was arrested in early 2002, that there was a follow-on attack, a radiological bomb attack that was disrupted. Almost immediately after the attack occurred, the attack was being blamed on a dearth of so-called human intelligence. Congressmen and congresswomen of both parties and all ideological stripes were demanding to know why human intelligence gathering and operations, especially from places like the CIA's Special Activities Division, were allowed to degrade to the degree that they did in the 1990s, and how these human intelligence capabilities could swiftly be revitalized. The bottom line is the landscape of threat perception regarding terrorism and deliberations over policy responses changed seemingly in an instant. Policies that were unimaginable just one day earlier, on September 10th, 2001, became no-brainers and swiftly passed Congress or became part of emergency presidential executive orders. Two pieces of legislation that I was working on pre-9/11, one was a bill to ease FISA requirements for certain, that's Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act requirements for certain Fourth Amendment wiretaps, and a second bill concerned the tracking of bank fraud and money laundering. Both were going nowhere before September 11, 2001, to be honest with you, and both, or the concept of them, swiftly became parts of policy, one as part of the Patriot Act, and the other as part of an executive order on terror financing and money laundering. Multiply those two provisions by dozens and dozens of others, and dozens more that no one had even yet thought up prior to 9/11, and you get a sense of the swirl of policy activity in the days and weeks after 9/11. It was easily one of the most monumental shifts in policy in the nation's history, right up there with NSC 68 and the creation of NATO in the early days of the Cold War. To give you an idea, I have some numbers. Within 4 months of the 9/11 attacks, President Bush had publicly issued 22 presidential executive orders related to 9/11, and that does not include the dozens of secret executive orders that were coming down. And more than 24 new measures proposed to Congress by the administration had already become law within 4 months. Now think how long it took President Obama to pass one law, the health care law. These congressional measures at the time included the September 18th joint resolution of Congress authorizing the President of the United States to, quote, use all necessary and appropriate force, unquote, against those who committed or aided the 9/11 attacks, and in order to, and this is an often overlooked provision, and in order to, quote, prevent any future attacks of terrorism against the United States, unquote. That's an important final clause, the preventive clause. I'm going to get back to that in a minute. Also among the big measures was passage of the USA Patriot Act, which went well beyond the minor FISA bill that I was working on. The Patriot Act was by far the most significant domestic counterterrorism law since the passage of FISA in 1978. It significantly lowered the threshold for anti-terrorism surveillance and the U.S. and in the United States, and it dismantled much of the so-called firewall between domestic and international intelligence gathering and between intelligence agencies and law enforcement agencies. One more general word on the immediate aftermath of the attacks, something that has stuck with me, something I found very disconcerting. That was the ease with which Congress, in particular, and the country in general, was willing to cede nearly all power, authority, and responsibility to the executive branch in the aftermath of 9/11. In fact, it would not be until June of 2004, more than a full 2.5 years after the 9/11 attacks, before the Supreme Court of the United States would offer its first ruling on the constitutionality of key aspects of the Bush administration's so-called war on terrorism, and it would be longer still before Congress took any active role in overseeing or partaking in counterterrorism policymaking. Years later, we watched many of the more aggressive Bush policies, such as coercive interrogations, secret prisons, indefinite detentions, warrantless wiretapping. We saw all of these eventually become political hot-button issues, and I emphasize years later. But the fact is, many of the very same latter-day critics, including in the Democratic leadership, were fully informed of the Bush policies, and in some cases in the weeks and months after 9/11 were pushing the administration and the CIA to make sure that what they were doing was enough and that they were, quote, acting aggressively enough, unquote, to quote one unnamed leader. So with that as contextual background, let me briefly mention a few fundamental changes in the way terror threats have been perceived since 9/11 and in the response to terrorism since then. We obviously don't have enough time to get into all aspects of the dramatically changed landscape of terrorism and counterterrorism since 9/11, but in my view, we do not need to delve too much into the details in order to understand some of the fundamental changes. That's because there have been what I would call two big macro changes. In firstly, our assessment of the nature of terror threats, and secondly, in our response to the threats. The first big macro change was the altered threat landscape, or more accurately, altered perceptions of the threat landscape. One of the most enduring aspects of the 9/11 attack was that it instantly undercut long-standing mainstream perceptions of the nature of terrorist threats. For generations, terrorism was most often understood as a tactic used by groups to gain attention for the particular causes, with the use of violence, even killing, understood as somewhat rational, or at least limited. As longtime terrorism analyst Brian Jenkins famously said in his classic description of terrorism, he said terrorists want, quote, a lot of people watching, not a lot of people dead, unquote. And that was certainly true for a whole variety of so-called traditional terrorist groups at the time, like the Irish Republican Army, or the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, or the Basque separatist group in Spain, ETA. These were groups that were open to or even seeking eventual seats at a negotiating table. On 9/11, this traditional understanding of terrorism was thrown a major curveball. What the United States and the world confronted on 9/11 was not a terror group seeking a seat at the negotiating table. It was a terror group seeking to blow up the negotiating table, everyone around it, and possibly even themselves. This was something very new and very dangerous, and as seen 10 years ago this week, very capable. On 9/11, a new template of terrorism had come of age. Religious-based terrorism with a powerful global narrative and a violent global vision, operating independently of any formal state support and with no limitations on casualties. In fact, the more casualties, the better. There are differences of opinion over just how new or how non-negotiable this form of terrorism really is, and others on the panel may point that out today. But there's no denying that on 9/11, we witnessed up close the handiwork of a dangerous new terrorist actor in contemporary international affairs. And there's no denying that preventing future attacks by Al-Qaeda and its affiliates or some other similarly inspired group remains the #1 priority of not just the United States government, but dozens of governments all around the world. As we see this morning with the latest credible terror alert, Al-Qaeda, even with its core in Pakistan and Afghanistan weakened, remains today the most likely source of another major attack. Particularly the evolving problem would be its inspired or affiliated groups gaining strength in other parts of South and Central Asia, North and East Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and elsewhere. With that, let me briefly say a few words on the second macro change since 9/11, change in the guiding principles that underpin policy responses to terrorism, at least in the United States. Much of this change obviously relates to the new assessment of the terror threat, as I just described. The best way to summarize this change and all of the sometimes controversial policies that flow from it is to say that prior to 9/11, the United States essentially treated terrorism as a criminal act, with terrorists and suspected terrorists afforded full judicial rights, and with strict limitations placed on the government's ability to engage in what we can think of as preventive action, such as detaining someone without any evidence that they actually committed a crime. After 9/11, the United States swiftly moved away from the law enforcement model in counterterrorism and toward what can best be described as a warfare model, which treats terrorism, at least in the guise of Al-Qaeda and its affiliates, as a revolutionary form of warfare, requiring a broader national security rather than primarily law enforcement response. Particularly in an age of catastrophic terrorism, the argument goes, simply responding to terrorist events after they occur with criminal indictments and prosecutions is not sufficient. The goal must be to prevent attacks from occurring in the first place, and that requires a far greater use of national, especially presidential, commander-in-chief powers. Everyone here today is, I'm sure, familiar with the policy outgrowth from this shift in America's macro approach to fighting terrorism. The so-called preventive paradigm, as it emerged from the September 18th, 2001 congressional authorization, laid the foundations for the Patriot Act, National Security Agency warrantless wiretapping, renditions, coercive interrogations, indefinite detentions, targeted assassinations, and all sorts of covert operations in dozens of countries overseas, all in the name of stopping the next attack. But let me point out a most important point that I want to conclude with, that while this approach may have been born during the Bush-Cheney administration, it remains alive and well under the Obama administration. Despite Obama's many promises during the campaign to quote-unquote reverse Bush's counterterrorism policies, and despite occasional symbolic gestures like efforts to close Guantanamo or try a high-profile terrorist in a civilian court, the fact is Obama has maintained and in some cases even bolstered many of the Bush administration's most aggressive and controversial policies, including renditions, targeted assassinations, indefinite detentions, warrantless searches and wiretaps, and a Dick Cheney-esque interpretation of executive power when it comes to withholding information under the so-called state secrets doctrine. And that leads me to my final concluding thought about where the United States currently stands in terms of terror threats and responses now 10 years after the 9/11 attacks and where we may be heading. I would make the case that the two macro changes that I pointed out in the assessment of terror threats and in the legal and national security parameters that now guide anti-terror policymaking, that these two macro changes have sparked an evolution over the course of the past 10 years and over the terms of two presidencies to form what can be thought of, for better or worse, and we can have some discussion on that at some point, but it's formed a sort of bipartisan counterterrorism consensus that's emerging. This rough but evolving consensus begins with a recognition that al-Qaeda and its affiliates form a unique national security threat requiring a national security response. And for this rough but evolving consensus, that response includes 3 core components, and each of those components is controversial in its own right. Those core components are, number 1, recognition of the necessity of strong executive powers and presidential freedom of action. Number 2, the critical role of aggressive intelligence gathering to level the playing field with sophisticated mass casualty terrorists that operate in the shadows. And number 3, reliance on military operations and covert actions to target terrorists and preempt terrorist planning and operations from abroad. These policy foundations were built under Bush, but institutionalized under Obama, not unlike the way Democratic President Harry Truman's then controversial containment policy was eventually institutionalized by Republican President Dwight Eisenhower in the 1950s. I should also add that along with these, I'm talking about mostly hard power policies here, but I should at least add that along with these hard power components of this evolving counterterrorism consensus also exist various softer power components to try to ideologically challenge al-Qaeda and win hearts and minds of potential recruits. Not surprisingly, Bush and Obama had somewhat different ways of going about this, but I will say that in both cases, the soft power, hearts and minds stuff has taken a big back seat to the more hard power approaches, which gives you a sense of the continuity of threat assessment from Bush to Obama. And I will finish by saying as long as this threat assessment remains, and the threat remains, we can expect further evolution and refinement of this evolving counterterrorism model, and we should also hope further oversight or increased oversight and more candor from government leaders on this challenge that will continue for the foreseeable future. And I'll conclude on one point to continue. Dick said that the biggest change or the biggest challenge is overestimating or underestimating the threat of terrorism, and with that comes a secondary challenge, which is the challenge of overreaction versus underreaction. And within this, the context of this new policy structure exists political wherewithal or flexibility on how it responds or how it doesn't respond, and we're going to continue to have to find a middle ground, because overreaction plays right into the hands of those who want to continue this war against us, but underreaction, unfortunately, and eliminating some of these tools that I just mentioned that have continued from Bush to Obama, as controversial as they may be, a sense of complacency, or in the Washington Post, Eugene Robinson wrote today that we already defeated al-Qaeda, so why do we still have these policies? That could lead to an underreaction that could be just as dangerous, because it's going to just take one more attack, even by a lone actor, as Dick pointed out, that could get this whole cycle of overreaction going again, which would play right into the hands of those who want to keep this fight going for the next generation. And I'm done for now, and I'll turn it back over to Tanya. Thanks.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Gottlieb. Next, we have Professor Kimberly Martin. So Professor Martin, she's a professor of political science and a former department chair at Barnard College, and she's also a member of the Saltzman Institute at Columbia. Her 4th book is about to come out, entitled Warlords, Strong-Arm Brokers in Weak States, and that'll be out in May 2012 from the Cornell University Press series on studies in security affairs. Her new research project has to do with non-state militias, and it asks whether and how patronage-based forces can be transformed into impersonal and professional military and police organizations. So again, really interesting stuff. Today she's going to talk to us about what social scientists think they've learned about terrorism and terrorists. Thank you.
Thanks, Tonya. Like Stuart, I was personally affected by September 11th. I was in New York when it happened. I went through the shock and the fear and the sadness that I'm sure many of us in the audience did. I went to the funerals. I comforted friends who had suffered losses. And then you may remember that what happened immediately after September 11th was the anthrax attacks that came through the U.S. mail. And I lived in New Jersey at that time, and it seemed that New Jersey was being particularly targeted by those anthrax attacks. And so that just added to the fear. And I think the low point for me was one day when I was commuting in, there was an armored personnel carrier guarding the Lincoln Tunnel, and that summed it up more than anything else. So the way I eventually processed my fear was by starting to teach a new class on political violence and terrorism at Barnard. I decided that I wanted to learn what caused terrorism and what that meant about how we should react to terrorism to prevent it from happening. And I wanted my students to be exposed to really good evidence and really good scholarship about terrorism, because there was so much hyperbole and so many people who really didn't know what they were talking about saying things in the news that I thought it was time that we put something together that allowed really good research on terrorism to come to the forefront. And the class got easier to teach with time because there's been a huge influx of new scholarship on the topic of what causes terrorism and what that means about counterterrorist activities. And so that's what I want to talk to you about today. There's a consensus about among social scientists that we don't want to use the word terrorists, because if we use the word terrorists, it implies that people are always going to commit acts of terrorism and that there is a particular individual who has a terrorist personality or something like that. Instead, rather than defining individuals as terrorists, we tend to talk about acts of terrorism. Terrorism as opposed to some other tactic of political action. So that's my starting point. And I think it's important also that we have a common definition of what terrorism is. And here again, there's a fair amount of agreement among social scientists. I'll talk about one exception as I go along. But there's a fair amount of agreement that terrorism involves acts of violence by non-state actors against non-combatants for political purposes. In other words, we know that states commit acts of violence against civilians, but that's not really what we want to talk about when we talk about terrorism in particular. And there's some disagreement about whether to include military targets in our target assessment of what terrorism is. But most people concentrate on acts of violence against non-combatants, against civilians or people who are not actively involved in fighting. We know that there are non-state actors who commit violence for non-political purposes. The best example is Aum Shinrikyo in Tokyo. Its purpose was to bring on the apocalypse. And so that's not an act of politics. But I would disagree a little bit with Stuart. I think that, in fact, al-Qaeda is carrying out acts of terrorism for political purposes. So what do we know about what causes terrorism? Well, we know what doesn't cause terrorism. We know now, what we didn't know so much in 2001, that terrorism is not caused by a lack of economic opportunity or a lack of educational opportunity. If any of you were involved in the policy discussions immediately after September 11th, that was just a real big thing that everybody was saying, we have to give more international assistance, we have to provide education to people abroad, and that'll stop terrorism. Well, Alan Krueger, who is an economist at Princeton, and he is the new chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors that Obama has nominated, did a major study. It's been also seconded by other major political scientists and economists, including David Layton at Stanford University, looking at reams of cross-national data that the vast majority of people who commit terrorist acts are well educated. They're in the middle to upper class, and so they're not poor. This actually fits with earlier data by area experts. We knew that the leaders of Marxist political violence in Russia, China, Central and South America during the Cold War and before the Cold War were more likely to be scholars than they were to be workers. We also know that scholars led some of the most horrific acts of violence against civilians in both the former Yugoslavia and the post-Soviet space, including Georgia. Krueger also demonstrated that wealthier countries produce more acts of terrorism than poorer countries do, and that economic inequality inside a society didn't seem to correlate with terrorist acts. So there's just no statistical relationship between poverty or lack of education and either the commission of terrorist acts or societal support for terrorist acts. And that's really significant because that means that terrorism is caused by factors that are different from the causes of other political violence. Paul Collier at Oxford University, who's an economist, did research at the World Bank that demonstrated that political violence in society, civil war, is correlated with economic inequality. But acts of terrorism and support for terrorism do not seem to be correlated with economic inequality. So what does cause terrorism? Well, scholars tend to divide the societal level from the leader level. So what do we know about the societal level? If you think about it, the people who commit and support acts of terrorism are really different from each other. They're the people who actually commit the acts. They're the people who plan the acts, who are maybe at a higher level than the foot soldiers. And then they're the citizens who tolerate terrorism and don't turn perpetrators or suspects into the police, who instead think that terrorism is an okay thing. Well, there's overwhelming evidence, again from Kruger, that societies that spawn terrorism, societies where the population seems to support terrorism rather than turning people who commit terrorist acts into the government, suffer from political inequality and a lack of political opportunity. So acts of terrorism don't seem to be associated with economic inequality, but they do seem to be associated with political inequality and the lack of political opportunity. The majority of terrorist acts appear to be committed by people who believe that they live in a politically unjust society, where they have no chance to make a difference through nonviolent action. So that's the first thing we know. The second thing we know is that the vast majority of terrorism is local. So the September 11th attacks and the al-Qaeda attacks that followed in various places around the world were rare in not being carried out in the same country where the perpetrators were located. Al-Qaeda is an exception. It's not the wave of the future. Martha Crenshaw had been talking about that even before the al-Qaeda attacks happened. She's a Stanford professor now who's been writing on terrorism since 1972. But now others have started demonstrating that fact with cross-national data. And so again, Kruger demonstrated that 90% of terrorist attacks have occurred in the country where the perpetrator lives. 90%. Well, what does this mean? How can we explain September 11th and al-Qaeda? It may mean that the real target was their home countries. Those were countries who were allied with the United States, but the societies were so closed and so repressive and such police states that there was no way for them to reasonably get away with a terrorist attack in those societies, and so it may have been easier to attack the United States as an open society and as an ally of those societies rather than committing the acts at home. And Martha Crenshaw was, again, the first person to make that argument. So that's a second thing that we know, that most terrorism is local. A third argument that has provoked some controversy, but that seems to have a fair amount of truth behind it, is that terrorism may be in reaction to what is perceived as a foreign occupation. If this is true, what matters is not having alliances with particular countries per se, but having a military presence abroad that's associated with those alliances. So the argument here is that the US bases in Saudi Arabia at the time of the September 11th attacks meant that the infidels were in Mecca and Medina, and from this point, the United States kept on making things worse by sending large numbers of ground troops into Iraq and Afghanistan, where they were perceived as occupiers. And this argument is most associated with Robert Pape, a professor at the University of Chicago, who founded the University of Chicago Project on Suicide Terrorism. His major explanation for suicide terrorism, again using just reams of cross-national data, is the presence of resented foreign military forces on home territory. And he argued that democracies were particularly susceptible to terrorist attack because terrorists understood that their publics would respond to attacks and demand an exit of those military troops from the places where they were abroad. Now, many scholars have poked holes into his logic and his evidence. He's been criticized for focusing only on suicide terrorism, which is actually not the most common form of terrorism, even though it's the kind that gets a lot of attention in the media. It's a small fraction of terrorist acts. He has been criticized for getting back to our original definition for including attacks on military targets, not just attacks on civilian targets. But his arguments have had real policy impact, perhaps because the arguments fit in with those who believed that the United States should have a smaller military footprint in foreign countries to decrease the military presence of the United States abroad. It certainly helps explain the U.S. reluctance to get involved in Libya on the ground. And it also explains probably our increasing desire to have only a very small number of special operations forces on the ground in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, and to pull out the large number of forces who had a large footprint. So that's about societal support for terrorism. Why do leaders support terrorism as opposed to some other form of political action? Well, there's agreement among virtually all analysts, including Martha Crenshaw, Bruce Hoffman, who's also been studying terrorism for decades, Andrew Kidd and Barbara Walter, as well as Robert Pape, that acts of terrorism are carried out by weak actors who cannot afford direct military attack. Suicide bombing in particular is a very low-cost act of violence. It doesn't take much to put a bomb on somebody and have them go blow up things and get a lot of attention for it. So terrorism is seen as being politically strategic. It may be designed to persuade some audience to take political actions by making them believe that otherwise the pain will continue. And so in political science jargon terms, we could say that in that sense, it's a form of credible signaling of political intentions and of future actions. That basically, if you don't stop what you're doing, we're going to continue attacking you. And we know that sometimes acts of terrorist violence work. The US withdrew from Lebanon after the Marines barracks were attacked. The US withdrew from Saudi Arabia after September 11th, largely because of the kind of argument that people like Robert Pape made. Spain withdrew from the Iraq coalition because of the 2004 Madrid bombing. It probably affected the election there and the policies of the new government. So sometimes acts of political terrorism do work to have political impact. And what this means for counterterrorism strategy is that if this is true, the counterterrorism strategy has to be very carefully calibrated to the specific aims of the people who are carrying out the acts of terrorism. So, as Stuart pointed out, sometimes negotiation with terrorists actually works if it involves giving in on something that has low strategic importance. But if it's something that has high strategic importance, something that would be vital to a country's interests, that means that negotiating with the terrorist doesn't make any sense at all, and instead what you do is have to put up a very strong front showing that those acts of terrorism will not change the political action that they are designed to change. And Audrey Kurth Cronin, who's at the National War College, argued in 2006 that this fact meant that al-Qaeda's end was inevitable, that it would rapidly come to a conclusion because the goal that al-Qaeda seemed to want, the political goal that al-Qaeda was following, establishing a caliphate over the entire Islamic world, was unreachable without international revolution, and the tactics that they used, suicide bombing and attacks against innocent Muslims, were horrifying the audience that they wished to appeal to. And this was actually supported by Ronan Bergman, an Israeli journalist, in September 2008, who demonstrated that by following what was happening on al-Qaeda websites, that al-Qaeda was turning away from urging suicide attacks and turning towards urging people to instead commit acts of terrorism using high-tech remote bombs. The best evidence, in fact, that Cronin may be right, and I think this is a very hopeful sign, is that the Arab Spring has not been hijacked by al-Qaeda. You have people coming from societies of political repression, political inequality, and you don't see them saying, so the reaction that we should be taking is to turn towards terrorism. Al-Qaeda has essentially been irrelevant in the Arab Spring. And I think that's a very positive sign that Audrey Kurth Cronin was correct. A second thing that terrorist attacks might be intended to do, though, is to send a signal internally to the group that might support the group in its home society, a signal that the group is still functioning cohesively, and that it is politically beneficial to continue to support that group. So Mark Juergensmeyer, a sociologist at UC Santa Barbara, says that the fact of there being an internal audience explains why responsibility is not always claimed for acts of terrorism. The internal audience knows who did it and doesn't have to be told. It can actually be an act of political outbidding to a larger domestic audience where there are political competitors saying, look how strong we are, come and support us instead of our competitors because we can still carry out these very, very violent attacks. So Bruce Hoffman and Gordon McCormick showed that in both Sri Lanka and Palestine, terrorist acts increased every time the moderate opposition looked like they were doing well. It was outbidding. It was saying, don't go with the moderate opposition, go with us. We're the ones who have the power and the strength to actually create change. So when this is combined with the earlier conclusion about political repression being associated with increased terrorism, it means that probably the most effective counterterrorism policy demonstrates that the state is stronger than the terrorists without engaging in repression. And so that's obviously very challenging. How can you show that you are a strong state without engaging in acts of political repression? The trick is to get the community to turn toward the state away from the terrorists and to leave the terrorists isolated. And a journalist named Ed Maloney, in his book on the Irish Republican Army, demonstrated that, in fact, this was why the United Kingdom was so successful in tamping down the IRA. when they had a policy of randomly imprisoning young people on the street who were suspected of terrorism and holding them for a long period of time, it actually made acts of terrorism go up. When they were successful at getting intelligence, turning people at the top towards the state, away from acts of terrorism, and stopping things that were perceived as being societally repressive, acts of terrorism went down and the IRA became a political group instead. So the final question I want to look at is what turns people away from being passive victims of perceived repression or supporters of some other form of revolution into being active supporters of terrorism? How do we explain how societies go towards a situation where they are supporting acts of terrorism? And there seems to be agreement here among social scientists as well that the interesting conclusion is it's their friends and other social connections. It's not mental illness. There's a popular perception that terrorists are all crazy, but there is no evidence of high levels of mental illness among the detailed records of suicide bombers, for example, that have been collected at the University of Chicago project. This was emphasized by Lindsay O'Rourke, a graduate student in that project who's written about female suicide bombers in particular. There's no evidence of higher levels of mental illness among the people who choose to be suicide bombers. The idea of support for terrorism being related to social networks was first proposed by James Coleman, a sociologist at the University of Chicago in 1988. And he argued, again, this is sort of from a technical perspective, and I apologize for throwing out this jargon, that social encouragement is how the free rider problem is overcome in groups to create an impetus for costly collective action. In other words, if you have a group of people, the natural tendency is to stand back and say, let somebody else do it. I don't have to take the risk of that behavior. And the way that you get a group to be revved up to actually take an action that is personally costly to individual members is through social encouragement. This was seconded by a major theorist of civil uprising behavior, Roger Peterson of MIT, also who got his graduate work at the University of Chicago. There's a pattern here. It was found in his study of Lithuanian rebel movements in the 1940s, and he showed that how you acted toward the occupier depended on your social networks and what your close associates did. Mark Sageman, one of the first network analysts for the CIA during the Afghanistan conflict back in the 1980s, famously argued in Leaderless Jihad, a book that provoked a lot of controversy, that international terrorism was both unstoppable but less threatening as the decade went by because it was being propelled by social connections on the internet among people who had minimal training and minimal resources as Al-Qaeda was being degraded. And he was being criticized by Bruce Hoffman for his lack of data. Hoffman was focused on the continuing threat of a well-organized group. An argument between them was made actually in the pages of the New York Times. But despite Hoffman's criticisms, even if you believe that Al-Qaeda is still a strong actor at a political level, I think that Mark Sageman's arguments have a really strong impact on how we think about counterterrorism, which is that if you want to stop people from supporting terrorism, you have to enter their social networks, enter their friendship networks, and get the people who are around them in their social environment to convince them that acts of political violence are not a good idea and that solving problems through nonviolent action is a better way to go. So, summing this all up, the real key to counterterrorism policy is getting networks of friends and networks of social supporters to advocate nonviolent solutions to problems. And in fact, some of the most creative work that's being done in this direction is being done in Saudi Arabia. There's a thesis by Amanda Johnson at the Naval Postgraduate School who argued that Saudi Arabia is doing a very effective job of turning people away from considering acts of violence who are currently in prison for having committed or supported acts of terrorism. And it's because their families were brought on board. They had personal mentors who maintained contact with them after they were released. They were provided with opportunities, and they were in a supportive network that said, it's okay, you don't have to commit acts of terrorism in order to get ahead in our society. So I'll stop there with what I hope is some provocative thinking, and I look forward to the discussion later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Martin. Okay, next up we have Professor Paige Fortna, who has a PowerPoint. So while she's getting that worked out, I will go ahead and introduce her. So Professor Fortna is a professor of political science at Columbia University and also a member of the Saltzman Institute, again, pattern here. So her research topics, her broader research topics have included durability of peace in the aftermath of both civil wars and interstate wars. Her most recent book is called Does Peacekeeping Work? Shaping Belligerent Choices After Civil War. which was published by Princeton University Press in 2008. Her current research continues to focus on long-term historical trends in war termination, but it's expanded now to include terrorism and its role in civil wars. So she'll be talking to us about current research today.
Mm-hmm. Right. Thanks, Tanya, and thanks everyone for coming. So Kim's talk sort of set this one up. I think this is coincidence, but kind of nicely, because what I'm going to be talking about is an example of my own scholarship on terrorism using some cross-national data. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is a paper that's part of a larger project on terrorism in the context of civil war, so domestic terrorism, which, as Kim just mentioned, is the vast majority of terrorism. And a number of the things that I will speak to here will sort of echo some of the things, sometimes agreeing with and sometimes contradicting with the rest, the sort of general literature that Kim has just outlined for us. There we go. So there's a large debate within the terrorism literature about whether terrorism is effective, whether it works. Probably sort of majority of that literature thinks that terrorism does work. That's why it's used, it's strategic, et cetera, et cetera. But there are some folks who are sort of arguing, no, it doesn't work. So there's this big literature. But when I started to look at this literature a little bit, I realized there's a big problem with this debate and with this literature, because almost all of the studies that look at terrorism are only looking at terrorist groups. They're not comparing terrorist groups with something else, with some other type of political action, for example. So this is a little bit like trying to decide if a drug is effective in a medical study when you're giving everybody the drug and you're not looking at a comparison category or a control group. So there's sort of a basic problem and a basic inability to answer some of our sort of most basic questions about effectiveness. So what I'm trying to do in this project is to look at civil wars as a set of cases where there's a relatively comparable population. There are rebel groups in all of these wars. They're all organized. They all have a political grievance against the state. Some of them use terrorism and some of them don't. And so we can compare the outcomes for groups who use terrorism and groups that don't. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to do in this larger project, and I'll talk about one piece of it today. So defining terrorism, for the purposes of this project, I'm defining terrorism fairly narrowly. So this is a definition that fits within the definition that Kim just gave us, but it's a little bit narrower, because all rebel groups are using violence for political ends, and it turns out that studies of violence against civilians in civil wars suggest that almost all, virtually all rebel groups target civilians in some way. So I want to look at a specific type of targeting of civilians, and that's symbolic and indiscriminate violence against civilians. And by symbolic, I'm using, this is sort of from the terrorism literature. What that means is that the audience of the violence is somebody other than the target of the violence. So groups are targeting civilians generally in order to put pressure on a government, not to put pressure on those civilians per se. So this distinguishes this type of violence against civilians from, for example, ethnic cleansing, where you're targeting people to try to get them to get up and move out of territory that you want, or the most common, most ubiquitous form of violence against civilians in civil wars is targeting individuals because you think that they're collaborating with the other side, or you want to deter them from doing so, or you want to force them to collaborate with your own side. That happens in 99.99% of all civil wars. So in order to distinguish rebel groups that use terrorism from those that don't, I don't want to use such a broad definition that I'm capturing everybody. So I want to use this more specific type of terrorism. So more concretely, what do I mean by terrorism or terrorist rebel groups? I mean groups that use a sustained and deliberate use of small-scale bombs, car and bus bombs, IEDs, suicide bombs, to attack public civilian places, restaurants, bombs, markets, etc. And so that fits fairly well with what we think of sort of intuitively as a terrorist attack. And if you look at the set of rebel groups that show up as terrorist, if you use this definition and this measurement, it fits pretty well with the groups that we think of as terrorist rebel groups, and some of the examples are there on the screen. In terms of thinking about effectiveness or winning, what do we mean by that? And a lot of the debate about effectiveness has sort of gotten into a little bit of a quagmire over what counts as success and what counts as failure. And I think we can get away from some of that quagmire by thinking of this as a continuum. And the two endpoints of the continuum are pretty straightforward. It's obviously rebel groups, what they really want is to win outright through a military victory. What they least want is for the government to crush them through a military defeat. So those are pretty obvious. I argue that the sort of second best outcome from a rebel group's perspective is a negotiated agreement. So this means that the government has recognized them as a legitimate negotiating partner, and there have been concessions on both sides, generally altering the status quo. So there are some political concessions to the rebel group if there's a negotiated agreement. There's a kind of second worst outcome from the rebels' perspective. These are wars that in the data that I'm looking at just kind of fizzle out. So the group still exists. It hasn't been eliminated outright. Otherwise, it would be coded as a government military victory. But these are groups that have been causing a lot of trouble in wars that have been killing over 1,000 people a year, and now they've fizzled down to such a low level that fewer than 25 people are dying a year, and often there are no deaths in these cases, but the group still exists. And then in the middle, I think about ongoing conflict. So these are groups that continue to survive. They haven't sort of fizzled away or been defeated, but they have not yet achieved any of their political goals. So they're sort of in the middle of this spectrum. So what I'm trying to do in this project is to compare rebel terrorist groups and rebel non-terrorist groups and see how they fare along this spectrum. That's kind of the basic idea. So I argue that terrorists will generally be unsuccessful. They will rarely, if ever, win outright, because on balance, terrorism undermines military effectiveness relative to non-terrorist rebel tactics. And I'm not going to go through all of the reasons that I think this, because I don't have time, but just to sort of skim over a few of them, terrorism is pretty much by definition not useful for taking and holding territory or degrading the opponent's military capacity. It is a low-cost way to inflict a lot of pain in a war of attrition, but it tends to backfire. It can often be used as a way of signaling resolve, but it tends to signal weakness. So it's not actually a credible signal of strength and resolve, the sort of a catchword we talk about in terms of bargaining theories of war. It can help advertise the cause, but it preaches to the choir. And mostly what it does is undermine legitimacy and turn potential supporters away. And even in sort of strategy of provocation, where groups are committing terrorist attacks in the hope that the government will then repress and there'll be a backlash that helps them, that can work sometimes, but it can also end up justifying a government cracking down so hard that it's able to defeat a terrorist or rebel group. I also argue that the second best outcome for rebels is unlikely if they're using, or less likely if they're using terrorism, in part because it undermines military effectiveness. Governments are going to be less likely to make political concessions to a group that is less militarily effective than one that is more militarily effective. It also undermines trust and creates commitment problems that makes negotiated settlement difficult to achieve. Governments, I think, to a one, have policies never to negotiate with terrorists. We know that they break those policies often, but the fact that they have those policies and that rhetoric makes it even harder for them to negotiate with a rebel group that uses terrorism than one that doesn't. On the other hand, I think that terrorism is kind of good for organizational survival of rebel groups because terrorist rebels are hard to defeat outright. They're likely just to live a long time. Small organizations can continue to inflict damage. The kinds of spoiling and outbidding dynamics that Kim was talking about tend to prolong conflicts. Counterterrorism often kind of flattens out organizations and makes them decentralized, so they're not good at achieving their goals anymore, but they are continuing to launch attacks. I have sort of thinking about this question about the effectiveness of terrorism. Some of the debate has been about effectiveness versus democracies, whether terrorism is more effective against democratic governments than non-democratic governments. And I think there are two reasons to think that it should be more effective or less ineffective, is maybe a better way to put it, against democracies. One is that the basic strategy here is to put pressure on civilians, or to inflict pain on civilians so that they'll put pressure on their government. That's going to be more effective if the civilians can more effectively put pressure on their government, which is true under a democracy. And it's also more likely that you'll provoke a government from being sort of too nice to being this kind of in-the-middle, wishy-washy, repressing, but not really effectively cracking down middle ground where a provocation strategy and backlash can happen, whereas against an autocracy, you're more likely just to justify really draconian measures and get yourself defeated. So there are a set of predictions that come out of all of this, that civil wars involving terrorist rebel groups should be longer, very unlikely to end in rebel victory, less likely to end in a negotiated agreement, more likely to fizzle out or end in a government victory, and relatively more effective versus democracies. Again, all compared to non-terrorist rebel groups. And that is if the world is all else equal, but of course the world is never all else equal. And so the first thing I have to do in this project is to think about which groups use terrorism. Why are some groups using terrorism and some not? This is a strategic decision. So terrorism, you know, it's a random act of violence, but it's not a strategy that is chosen at random. So the first thing I do in this project is to look at all of these rebel groups, and this is the data that I have here is from the post-Cold War. And about 30% of the groups that I'm looking at in civil wars in this period are using terrorism, and 70% aren't. So drawing on the terrorism literature and on the literature on civil war, I look at a bunch of things that we might think will make groups more likely to use terrorism. And a number of the things that I find kind of fit pretty squarely with the broader terrorism literature. Terrorism is more likely against democratic governments. Again, remember that these are all just cases where there is a civil war. It's more likely if there's a religious difference between the rebel group and the government that it's fighting. More likely in larger or more populous countries and in richer countries. There's a regional effect that hasn't been particularly well theorized, that terrorism is significantly less likely in civil wars in Africa. But that all sort of fits pretty squarely with the rest of the literature. Then there are a few surprising findings that come out of this. One has to do with secessionist conflict, and this speaks to Bob Pape's argument about terrorism versus foreign occupiers. Unlike what Pape would predict, I actually find that terrorism is significantly less likely in secessionist conflicts than in non-secessionist conflicts. I sort of threw in religion because this isn't really conventional wisdom in the academic literature, but the conventional wisdom kind of on the street, that is that terrorism is associated with Islam. There's absolutely no evidence for this. In fact, if anything, Islamic groups are somewhat less likely to use terrorism than non-Islamic rebel groups, or non-Muslim rebel groups, I should say. And then the most surprising thing here is I looked at the effect of relative strength. Now, the fact that terrorism is a weapon of the weak is in almost everything you read about terrorism. It's become essentially a cliche that terrorism is a weapon of the weak. It turns out nobody had actually ever looked, which was surprising to me. But if you actually measure the strength of rebel groups and look at which ones use terrorism and which ones don't, it's not the weakest groups that are using terrorism. There's absolutely no evidence for that. In fact, if anything, it's stronger groups that are using terrorism. There's not a statistically significant effect that terrorism is a weapon of the strong, but it is clearly not a weapon of the weak. Again, in this context of civil wars. So all of these groups are somewhat strong enough to launch a rebellion. So that was something that I sort of found along the way, but it's, I think, a very interesting finding. Okay, so then getting back to my original question about the effectiveness of terrorism, in the paper there's a lot of statistical tables, and I'm not going to put up my multinomial logit stuff here, but I'll just give you kind of a crude look at the data in some graphs. So there are a couple of things, I think this has a laser pointer. There are a couple of things to notice about this graph in terms of the outcomes of civil wars. The first is that, there we go. The first is over here. So the red bars are the terrorist rebel groups, and the blue bars are the non-terrorist rebel groups. So where we go? Over there. There are no cases in this time frame of full-scale civil wars in which a terrorist group achieves outright victory. Not a one. Terrorist groups are much more likely to last longer, to be ongoing at any given point in the data, but they're less likely to reach an agreement than our non-terrorist groups, and they're more likely to have these sort of bad outcomes for the rebels, either fizzling out to through low activity or a government victory. So that sits pretty well with a set of predictions that terrorism will make wars last longer, but that terrorist groups will fare less well than non-terrorist groups. I also looked at this issue of democracy, and again, this is kind of a crude look at the data, but all of this holds up in the more complicated, sophisticated statistical analysis. So this is the terrorist groups fighting democracies versus non-democracies, and here I've just collapsed the categories. So this is success here defined as either reaching an agreement or outright victory. There are no outright victories here, as we saw before, so this is really whether groups are achieving a political settlement. And they're more likely to do so against democracies than against non-democracies. And then if we compare that to the non-terrorist groups here, non-terrorist groups are actually more effective against non-democracies than against democracies, but again, you see that the success rate for the non-terrorist groups is higher than it is for the terrorist rebel groups. How am I doing for time? Just to kind of summarize the findings of all of this, wars in which rebels use terrorism, they do last longer, but terrorist rebel groups are extremely unlikely. In fact, in this data, they never win outright. They're less likely to get sort of the second best outcome from the perspective of a rebel group, of a negotiated agreement that involves concessions to their side. They are more effective or less ineffective against democracies than against non-democracies, but overall, terrorist rebel groups generally fare quite a bit worse than non-terrorist rebel groups. Now, again, as I keep repeating, this is in the context of civil wars. So what, if anything, does that tell us about al-Qaeda? Well, for one thing, as Kim mentioned, most terrorism takes place in the context of domestic terrorism, local terrorism, in the context of civil wars. So I think part of the point of this research is to kind of make us broaden our perspective a little bit, to think about not just the terrorism that affected us here in New York and the United States 10 years ago, but the terrorism that affects most people around the world is this type of terrorism. This type of terrorism is quite ineffective. How well this translates over to the effectiveness of transnational terrorism is something my research can't speak to directly, because I don't have a set of comparable transnational non-terrorist groups to compare them to. But I think a lot of the logic of this about the reasons that terrorism is ineffective spill over, essentially. The issues, especially about undermining legitimacy and undermining political support, I think translate to transnational terrorism as well as to domestic terrorism. But again, this is sort of my theoretical speculation more than my empirical hard data, because we don't have a comparison group that allows us to make that comparison empirically. So I will just conclude by saying that I think what this project can do is sort of by introducing variation, by introducing a control group of a group of relatively comparable sets of rebel organizations who choose not to use terrorism, that allows us to shed light on two very important policy-relevant questions that have not been particularly well addressed in the terrorism literature, because the terrorism literature is so focused only on the terrorist groups and not at these other groups. So the first is, where does terrorism occur, which, as I mentioned, I kind of looked at kind of on the way to getting to my main question, but some of the most surprising findings are there, and then the question of whether terrorism works. So on the first question, this research calls into question a lot of the conventional and popular wisdom, particularly the sort of cliche that terrorism is a weapon of the weak, but also popular impression that terrorism is associated with Islam. And I should have said this probably at the outset, this is ongoing research and findings are somewhat preliminary, but these findings are holding up as I'm continuing through. And then on the question that I started with, does terrorism work? Is it effective? Do terrorists win? The short answer is no. Thanks.